Now, the UN and rights groups are criticizing India for deporting Rohingya asylum seekers to Myanmar, where the Muslim minority has been persecuted. So Amnesty International has accused the government of disrespecting international law. A Rohingya family of 5 was expelled last week, the second deportation in the past few months. India's Hindu nationalist government regards the Rohingya as illegal migrants and a security risk. Well, India's lower house of parliament has recently approved a bill that would grant citizenship to minorities fleeing persecution in neighbouring countries, but Muslims are excluded from this list. Let's speak to Bhakti Nair, who's a legal and policy advisor for Amnesty International in India. She's joining us via Skype from Bengaluru. Thanks very much for speaking to us. What can you tell us about the circumstances of this particular family that's been deported back to Myanmar and their reported deportation, in fact, because you are unhappy with the Indian decision?
Thank you for having us. So I'd like to start by just saying that Amnesty International India is deeply concerned with the Indian government's policy of forcibly returning Rohingya asylum seekers and refugees to Myanmar. This particular family that was returned last week was in fact registered with the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency in India, and they'd repeatedly asked to be able to meet the family and speak with them, but the Indian government chose to ignore the UNHCR's request. So this is in addition to the fact that the Indian government has dubbed asylum seekers and refugees as illegal migrants and are sending them back to Myanmar. They're in fact even stopping UNHCR from speaking to people who are registered as asylum seekers with the organization. So Amnesty India is quite concerned about this, and we have been campaigning for the Rohingya people who are in India for a while now. But unfortunately, the government seems to be going ahead with this policy of forcibly returning Rohingya asylum seekers and refugees to Myanmar, where they are at risk of serious human rights violations.
Just put this into a little bit of context for us and tell us how widespread this practice is of the deportation of Rohingyas from India back to Myanmar. And actually, once they get to Myanmar, where are they deported to in Myanmar?
Right. Okay. So the thing is, the Indian government states that there are about an estimated 40,000 Rohingya people in India. Well, the UNHCR states that around 18,000 of them are actually registered with the UNHCR office in India, either as asylum seekers or refugees, and they're spread out over the country. In various states. Now, in August of 2017, the Ministry of Home Affairs kind of declared this policy that they will be forcibly returning all these so-called illegal immigrants. They refuse to acknowledge that they are asylum seekers and refugees, and instead are calling them illegal immigrants and saying that therefore they need to be sent back to Myanmar. October 2018 was the first time we saw a batch of Rohingya people being sent back. There were 7 Rohingya men who were sent back through the Indo-Myanmar border in the northeastern state of Manipur. And the issue is that once they're sent back to Myanmar, there's not a lot of information as to what happens with these people. So while we as the international community know that they are at risk of serious human rights violations when they go back to Myanmar, unfortunately, we're not able to follow up with them. So there's very little information about what happens to people once they go back to Myanmar. So on October 7, people were sent back. On 2nd of January this year, 1 man was sent back. And then the following day, a family of 5, as we've talked about, were sent back. So once they go back to Myanmar, we don't know what's happening with them. So we're trying our best to make sure that the government stops this policy now and more people aren't sent back.
For those who support this policy, and particularly those in the government, they'll say, well, we already taken a large number of refugees in India, not only Rohingya, but other refugees as well. And in fact, these refugees are a threat to national security. Is that an argument that you buy at all?
Sorry, I've lost the audio. Could you repeat that?
Bhakti Nair, I'm saying that for those who support this policy by the Indian government, they may say that India already takes in a large number of refugees, and these particular Rohingya refugees, according to some in the government, are a threat to national security. Is that an argument that you buy?
So that is something that they have been saying, but what we have been making clear ever since they first started using this argument about the Rohingya people is that there haven't been any substantial claims to back up this argument. They haven't shown any information about the Rohingya people presently in India posing any threat to the Indian population. In fact, there are two Rohingya refugees who have filed a case with the Supreme Court appealing against this policy of expulsion, and even to the Supreme Court, there haven't seemed to be any substantial evidence provided about the Rohingya in India posing a threat. So one of the things that Amnesty does say is that the UN Refugee Convention has a mechanism to vet people to make sure that they are not a threat to the national security, and to ensure that these asylum seekers are in fact in need of refugee protection. But as India hasn't signed on to the Refugee Convention, they're not using that check and balance that is inbuilt into the refugee protection mechanism. So we do call upon the Indian government to adopt the UN Refugee Convention and follow the legal process that has been established to ensure that the refugees that do need help are helped, and that nobody is turned away on baseless grounds.
All right, Bhakti Nair, we thank you for speaking to us.